Day zero is the moment before company formation, when a founder decides to take the plunge, follow their dream, and commit to pursuing their vision of change. On day zero, you'll hear founders tell their story.
Hi, I'm Suchi Saria. I'm the founder CEO of Bayesian. I'm also hold an endowed chair professorship at Hopkins. I'm also a Day Zero Advisory Council member, and today I'm here to interview another Advisory Council member, Don Trigg. Don, welcome. So excited to have you here.
It's great to be with you, Suchi. I'm super excited for this conversation as well.
You don't really need an introduction. Most people in healthcare already know you, and I don't know if they know all of the different exciting things you've been involved in. So give our listeners a little bit of a preview of your entrepreneurial journey.
I spent a decade in Washington in the public policy space, and that was really came at healthcare from a budget and tax perspective, really thinking about things like entitlement reform. That was sort of my introduction to key pieces of the regulatory and statutory environment for healthcare. And then people largely know me in the context of the role that I played as the president of Cerner Corporation, which is an organization that I was recruited to by Nancy Ann DeParle, a longtime Obama and Clinton administration official, along with Senator Jack Danforth, longtime senator from Missouri and a mentor of mine. And so that was really my introduction into the intersection of healthcare and IT. A very incredible mentor and founder CEO of Cerner Corporation, Neil Patterson, took me on my entrepreneurial journey inside healthcare IT, both at Cerner, but also in an early stage company that I was involved in called CodeWright in the computer assisted coding space, where you and I had a number of mutual friends on the technical side. So I have had the opportunity not only to play a variety of different roles inside a very large Fortune 500 company that really strive to think about entrepreneurial scale, but also an early stage startup company that we scaled and then subsequently sold to the HIS division of 3M.
So Don, you just described two really interesting big changes that's happened in the last 10 years, I'd say, at the intersection of healthcare and IT. One, which is the formation of the EMR as a foundational layer, where we're going from paper records to electronic records, and what that means in terms of everything else that can be built on top. And two, an example use case where you all went to take the data itself and starting to implement AI ML technologies to be able to do coding in an automated way so that you can do computer assisted coding. Tell me from your perspective, now that we have this EMR as a foundational layer and more broadly, a digitized health record, what are some areas where you see like most exciting areas for impact in the next 5 to 10 years?
Look, we're struggling through some of the early stage dynamics of first-time digitization of an industry. And so I think rightly, there has been frustration with the adverse impacts of technology deployment around productivity, things like usability of the data for purposes of advancing clinical, operational, and financial change. And frankly, some of the associated people and process changes that need to happen to really get to role-based shifts and task automation and some of the things that will really allow us to tackle the healthcare cost curve. So we're very early in this process, but I think when we have an opportunity to pause and gap up, we can get very excited about not just second order use cases around the data, but the things that you're working on, these very compelling third order use cases that really begin to change healthcare as an industry. And so I think we're just very early in that process, Suchi, but I think it's very profound, very important. And it plays out, in increments that we will measure on a multi-year or decade basis. But I really believe, and you and I have talked about multiple times, this is going to be a big and transformative decade. In fact, I have posited that the things that played out in the 2010s will make the 2020s as transformative and impactful as the 1960s, where we saw passage of Medicare and Medicaid. So we're right in the middle of a big transformative change that's just beginning to play out.
I think one of the very interesting things I saw last couple of conversations we've been having very recently is staffing shortages. People are seeing with COVID, people are burnt out. A huge part of the burnout is like having to navigate on a day-to-day basis all the information explosion that's happening in healthcare, and how do you make it so that you can use this information in a productive way to make it very easy to do the right thing. And almost like ideally, in other sectors, we've seen massive productivity gains from better use of information in the right way. So I feel like the EMR's kind of created a layer to make all those tooling now available. And we're sort of just at that stage where more and more exciting efforts are starting to come out that are leveraging the data to make it very easy to do the right thing. And perhaps even simple things like, we should be able to improve ratios by providing, AI ML technologies that are sort of parsing this data, scanning this data, providing a second pair of eyes. So I'm very excited, just like you are. You've been part of both big and small companies. And how do you feel about, as you're seeing sort of this next 10 years, lots of new exciting ideas coming to the forefront that's going to get implemented. We're going to go from phase 1 of this digitalization to phase 2, where it's going from exploration to mature ideas at place. What's your take on what big companies do really well versus little companies? Like, compare and contrast your experiences at these different types of places you've been at.
Look, the SWOT analysis has both opportunities and risks associated with it, both for the big company and the small company in the category. I think one of the things I would observe over the last 2 decades, I think more true today than when I came into healthcare IT in the early 2000s, is government's role as regulator and payer is a really important dimension of how change plays out in healthcare. So Nancy Ann DeParo likes to say payment is policy, and I think that's right. And so much of what we describe as the workflow impositions on the provider and that burnout is attributable to regulatory and payment related requirements that are a feature of what it looks like to operate in a health economy in which government is not only the largest regulator, but also the largest payer. And those are trend lines that will continue as we see boomers age into Medicare and we see onward growth of Medicaid. So that's a big thing that I think we need to appreciate and understand about the healthcare landscape and the health economy. The second thing I would say is that because of that, a lot of what we see play out is iterative and plays out incrementally in small steps over time. And I think rather than, we should be frustrated about that, but we should also recognize it as part of what operational progress looks like for the enterprise. And that's true of organizations big and small. So things like the data blocking provisions and the interoperability provisions, which you and I have talked about, I think there's a nice regulatory progression playing out that wasn't a part of the stimulus in 2009 and the subsequent meaningful use regs, but now has been addressed statutorily and regulatorily, and now will drive greater levels of data liquidity and create new opportunities for data use as this decade plays forward. So really understanding the kind of entrepreneurial notion of the art is in the timing and how regulatory and payment realities drive change, I think is a big part of what success looks like for organizations of any size. And then the final thing I would just say is, big companies do have structural advantages inside large, heavily regulated industry segments. So there's particularly functional capabilities inside the large enterprise that don't exist at a small C-round, company trying to go from 50 plus million in top to 100 million in top line. And so cleverness is required in terms of what it looks like to think through some of these key areas inside healthcare. That is the complexity facing the smaller organization. At the same time, they can be more nimble and agile and entrepreneurial in a ways that can be harder for the large behemoths who have those capability sets, but perhaps are more wedded to traditional product lines, traditional solution offers.
Yeah, very, very interesting. I think the point about policy driving change and figuring out a way both to leverage policy or being more cognizant of it to influence strategy,
For sure.
both from systems that are, used to thinking about it, but also startup founders, right? Or innovators, for them to be integrating policy as part of strategy more closely. And then also this very interesting point you made, Don, that isn't as true in other sectors, and definitely less so true in tech, I would say, is the very heavily regulated nature of healthcare. And therefore the need to have an arm and arsenal to be able to think harder about what this means from a day-to-day existence perspective. And maybe this means more partnerships, like we saw for vaccines, right? Like the Pfizer BioNTech type partnership, where there was an innovator that was able to very quickly produce the solution, but by partnering with Pfizer, they were able to disseminate the solution broadly very, very
Absolutely.
fast.
We tend to focus a lot on product innovation. You and I can get very excited about, data as product strategies that play out and solve key problem areas in the enterprise. But big pieces of what you and I are talking about that will play out in the coming decade are business model innovation. And so when we start thinking about business model innovation, you start thinking about, what does the partner ecosystem look like? How do we think about alignment strategies, both within our sector of operation, but increasingly across the health economy, non-traditional partnerships that span providers, working with payers, perhaps also working with pharma as we think about some of the use cases around therapeutics, vax admin, et cetera. So I think we're going to see an explosion of partnership activity, and really asking yourself as an organization and as a leader, what does it look like to partner well, whether I'm a large Fortune 500 company or I'm an early stage startup who sees partnership and channel opportunities as a key strategy for increasing reach.
Would you be open to sharing your thoughts on what does it mean to partner well?
Yeah, for sure. With a little bit of a bias towards our health system leaders, I think health systems need to be really thinking about executive level ownership. So who is that executive owner who can be the champion across and up the organization for a partnership is really pivotal. Whether I'm partnering with big tech or I'm partnering with a point solution company with aspirations for platform, I have to have an executive champion. Secondly, I think we're always looking for scale benefit and scale impact. So there are 1,000 different science experiments across 20% of GDP in the health economy. But how do we start proving out impact at scale? So someone has to really have a roadmap for enterprise-wide deployment and impact. And then finally, to the discussion we were having earlier, someone really has to be thinking about what's it look like to harvest that qualitative and quantitative impact and really be an evangelist for those impacts, not only with a go-to-market and business lens, but also as it relates to convening and advocacy efforts in a way that creates consensus around how things like regulatory and payment should support strategies that can have impacts on quality, cost, or experience. So I think those are three essential dimensions of what it looks like to partner well. And that is both with a lens towards the large company and what it looks like for them to be a good partner, as well as an earlier stage company like yours, where you're highly dependent on marquee client relationships and or larger partnerships.
I do know you're writing a book around some of your experiences. I'd love to hear a little bit about that.
For sure. We are in the final stages of completing a book called On the Health Economy, and it's subtitled around Ground Rules for Leaders. And so Georgetown University Press is going to be publishing it. It's something that we began thinking about before the pandemic, but then was meaningfully impacted and informed by the events that played out in 2020 in particular. And so we're excited to put it out in the public domain and let it play a small role in, I think, informing people's thinking around some of the key changes that we think are going to play out over the course of the next decade. So we do believe you're going to see an elevated role for the person with emphasis on cost, quality, and experience. So we think the trend around consumerism and the person is real. We do think there's going to be a shift in the payment landscape in a way that drives payer-provider convergence and really starts to reimagine how providers design, organize, and deliver care on the provider supply side of the health economy. And then to our discussion today, we also believe that leaders are probably underweighted in terms of thinking enough about health policy and the associated topics of health politics as healthcare has become more fully political, and how they play into their strategies for deploying operational efforts within the markets that they operate in and the communities that they serve. So that's a quick encapsulation of it, and we're super excited about it. Georgetown's been a great partner for us around that publishing activity, and we're looking forward to having market conversations around it over the course of the coming months.
Very exciting. My own background tries to marry engineering with health policy, so I'm very excited to hear you emphasize how important that is and how it isn't getting as appreciated as it ought to be.
As you know, because you've spent a big part of your career working on it, breaking down the silos that exist inside healthcare and really getting to applied best practice is a big piece of what needs to happen for us to be successful in the decade ahead. And hopefully this book will provide some framing around that in a way that will drive those conversations across the industry.
I can't wait for this book to come out. I'm very much looking forward to it. And Don, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks, Suchi. This was great.